That bread dough has had enough time to rise, and so let's pull it out of the oven. The first thing you'll notice is it's risen quite a bit from the original volume. Also, you'll see quite a bit of bubbles that are going on inside there. All those bubbles are a side effect of the yeast eating the sugars. The bubbles are full of carbon dioxide, which will do a phenomenal job in helping us make a great loaf of bread. Before we get too far along, we want to get our oven preheating. Because we cook this bread at a higher temperature, it takes longer for the oven to preheat. So we'll start the preheating before we start kneading our bread. Take a regular old pizza stone, put it in your oven and preheat your oven to 450 degrees. Now, as we mentioned before, the enzymes in the flour have had a chance to break down some of the glutens that are inside the bread. So now those long strands of protein have been cut down into little teeny pieces. However, we need to get them to line up straight. So we're going to knead the dough for about 5 more minutes. Once it's had a chance to knead, you'll see all those strings coming off the dough. This is a good thing. That's a prime example of the gluten's activated. Now, the reason you need this is the glutens hold the bread dough together so that when it bakes, it traps all the carbon dioxide. Therefore, it allows you to have a much airier, lighter loaf of bread. One little warning you're going to want to consider. This bread is sticky. Now, one thing I found to be effective is to either coat your hands in butter, vegetable oil, or just a little old-fashioned flour sometimes will do the trick. We set aside a little bit of flour before. We'll want to make sure that we take that flour and sprinkle it across our counter so that when the bread dough hits the countertop, it's not going to stick to it. Again, make sure your hands are generously greased. Sprinkle some flour over the top of the bread and rub it around the top. Again, what you're trying to do here is make the bread so it's easy to work with. Then what you do is you tuck the sides up and under, sprinkle a little more in to make sure it stays dry on the outside until you end up with a nice round ball. While we're waiting for our oven to come up to temperature, we're going to let this bread dough sit for a few minutes. That way it'll give it a more chance for that yeast to rise. Now, by turning the dough, all that sugar that the yeast had consumed typically has gone away over a 2-hour proofing process. But by turning the bread, it gives that sugar a chance to rearrange itself and the yeast can find that sugar. Therefore, the yeast has got more to eat, which means more bubbles, better bread. While waiting for the bread to rise, it's a good idea to get some parchment paper. Now, parchment paper is different than your standard wax paper that you would find in your regular grocery store. The difference being, wax paper obviously has wax, where parchment paper is coated with silicone and can handle higher temperatures and doesn't make your food taste all waxy. While we're waiting for the oven to heat up, it's a good idea to take this dough and transfer it over to our parchment. Again, maintaining and forming it into whatever shape we want to use once we have our bread made. Now, I'm going for more of an elongated French bread style, as you can see. But you could do circles or any artisan shape that you wish. Our pizza stone has had an opportunity to really heat up. Now, a word of caution when you're pulling this pizza stone out of the oven, it's going to be hot, hot, hot. Carefully transfer your bread dough to the pizza stone. It's important that if you jostle this around too much, you'll end up breaking a lot of those bubbles. So be very gentle as you move it onto the stone. One other baker's trick that we haven't talked about, spray bottle. But right before you put this in the oven, give your dough just a quick spray on the outside. What that's going to do is that allows water to form on the outside, which acts as a better conductor. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but by putting water on the outside of the dough, you actually get a crust to your bread. Finally, before putting it in the oven, I like to put just a small cut right across the top. You don't have to go too deep here, just deep enough so that when it comes out, it gives room for the bread to expand. And it also allows the inner part, the thickest part of the bread, to cook more evenly along with the rest of the bread. After you've made the cut, you want to get this dough into the oven right away. Put it on the middle shelf for about 45 minutes. Once the bread has had about 15 minutes to cook, You can practice the old magician's technique and grab the edge of the parchment, give it a good tug, and it'll pull right out from underneath the bread, leaving the bread exposed to the stone. Now this is important because the stone is going to help to whisk moisture out from the bottom of the bread. So two things happen. It's not going to stick, but also it's going to have a nice thick crust. One other thing to keep in mind, after you pull the parchment out, at again about minute 15, you're going to want to turn your temperature down to about 300 to 325 degrees depending on your oven. Any more than that and the bread is going to cook too fast and you're going to have a crunchy outside and an undone inside. As you get down to the final 5 minutes, it's really easy to see how nice and brown the loaf has become. But we want to make sure that it's done on the inside. So using an instant read thermometer, we're going to insert it and make sure it reads around 200 to 210 degrees. Once we hit that temperature on the inside of the bread, we're done. As we pull the bread out of the oven, of course it's important to use hot pads. In addition, make sure that you immediately transfer it onto a cooling rack. This will make sure that condensation doesn't build up on the bottom of the bread, making the nice crust that we worked so hard to develop go soggy. The end result is a delicious loaf of bread with wonderful texture, great crust, and an incredible crumb, all because of a little know-how.